Hello and welcome back to the final session of today's alumni event. Just a reminder, if you've joined us for the first time, I'm Jonathan Reynolds, working at the Side Business School, University of Oxford, and a Deputy Director of CDRC. It's a real pleasure to host these sessions. And for our final block of material, we're going to welcome two alumni sessions, and then we're going to conclude with a great panel discussion. And just as a reminder, please do use the chat to pose questions. If your chat says offline, then just refresh your browser and back into the box, and that will mean that you post your question and chat, and I can take those into account when we ask questions of our speakers and the panel later on today. So we're going to move to the final two alumni presentations, and you'll recall that I said I wanted to ensure that we had a mix of alumni that represented all kinds of different career journeys. And you'll notice that those of you that saw my presentation at the beginning of the day, we talked about a number that had gone into academic careers. And our next speaker is just one of those, Anastasia Ushakova, who is a senior research associate at Lancaster University. And as we'll hear from her, her career journey started with the MDS scheme and an internship at British Gas. And she's now working as part of a major research consortium at Lancaster, which she'll describe to us. But again, it's a great example of a very different kind of career journey that has resulted from an initial engagement with the scheme and then a continuing association with commercial organizations in taking her research forward. So without any further ado, Anastasia, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for inviting me, and also to organizers for creating this event today to look back at the scheme. As I said, my name is Anastasia. I used to be in the Consumer Data Research Centre before. I did my MSc in 2015, and then I did my PhD also in CDRC UCL. So today I talk to you a little bit about my background, but also what I'm doing now and how kind of the skills I gained continue and given through my career. So just to give you a bit of background, I think many people today kind of mentioned that they come from maybe geography as their background, maybe GIS. I actually never engaged with geography through my PhD, and I come from economics. And when I did my MSc in public policy, that's where I came across the project with British Gas through the scheme. And back then I was really excited about quantitative methods, but I also really wanted to do something that had some impact. So it wasn't just a project, kind of, you often do your project in university and then it just sits there somewhere and you never get to do anything about it. So I was really attracted by this opportunity. And then kind of naturally, I was really lucky, opportunity presented itself, and I continued working with Paul Longley and also Professor Mikhailov, who used to be my MSc dissertation supervisor and become my PhD supervisor later on. So what did I do back then? I'm not going to go in much detail, but if you're interested to hear more, kind of you're welcome to look up. I actually have a paper that was written as a result of this work. But one of the key research questions back then for me was working with British Gas on identifying fuel poor customers from smart meter data. And smart meter data is something that has been on the agenda of kind of both policymakers, academics, industry as something really, really promising that can generate lots of insight going forward. So there is definitely a lot of hunger for understanding that data, but there is lots of challenges associated with that too. So my project was to basically take that data set and see what can we do for that identification of vulnerable customers. It's taken about 3 months, and first month and a half-ish, maybe almost 2 months I spent on site, which was really nice. So from the day one of my project, I joined the company, I had a desk space, I was given a laptop, I joined a variety of meetings, so I really felt like an employee. And the reason it was really nice to do that because it gave me a very good perspective of, what is company challenges, what do they discuss, what their week looks like, and that gives you a very good idea of their timelines, priorities. So when you plan your research, you can take those into account. So what did it do for me? In some ways, it gave me kind of a bit of a taste of both worlds. I always wanted to be in academia, like I felt that I wanted to do a PhD, but I didn't want to be that person who never kind of seen industry, because you never know what you want until you try a couple of things as well. So the project was an amazing way to just do a little bit of both, see what fits in. And for me, research felt like more natural space, but I really wanted to carry on the collaboration. So I got a bit of a grasp of things, but I couldn't really exercise them. So when the PhD was advertised in CDRC, I had an interview and said, well, I do want to work on this data. I really like it. Can I please do this? And that's become a kind of subject of my project in the end. And I naturally kind of just continued researching this and answering more questions with the data. For others, I know this may lead to a post in the same or similar organization. So in my case, I kind of carried on doing more or less the same thing, but just had the chance to expand it and lead the project myself. So in my PhD, I continued working with the data, and because we found that there are numerous challenges with this data set, what my PhD in the end become is a comprehensive overview of such data set. And I surveyed all sorts of methods. So I guess some of you who data scientists here will know that there is so many tools out there. You could use clustering, you could use predictive tools, there is machine learning, there is kind of more traditional statistical methods, then there is forecasting. So in my project, I looked at a variety of those methods and I saw, how are they working, what kind of insights we can generate, and if yes, what kind of research questions we can answer with them, and if not, what kind of methodology we need and tools and software. So as a result, I had quite a bit of numerous impact actually. So I was invited for a variety of talks, and they were not only academic. I was invited for government roundtables. I was also invited to overview methodology for various government departments, and I also been on all sorts of data science conferences, which had nothing to do with energy. So in some ways, it gave me this kind of not only set of skills that allow me to talk to a variety of communities out there, but also something very unique that I wouldn't have gained in traditional PhD, because I would be focused on kind of specific projects and I wouldn't have that space of communication out there that I gained really, really early in my master's. So this is just a bit of a sneak peek. I added a couple of references in the end, or you can find them also on my webpage or my Google Scholar. But this is just a presentation of some research we did. We obviously looked at clustering. This is one of the biggest things that people kind of start with these data sets. And we found that, for instance, depending which data input you have and how heterogeneous the smart meter use can be, you can get very different solutions, and the data analysis should be targeted towards that. Also kind of given the research interests of the group I was engaging with, which was Paul Lonely's group. So we looked also in geodemographics and potential links to explain some of the variation energy use. And that also proved to be challenging. So it kind of made us think, what is special about this data? So further research can treat this maybe in a more unique way. So since then, I've taken a bit of break from research. The first post I got after PhD was teaching post in University of Edinburgh. I've been there for a year and a half, and I've been always passionate about teaching statistics. And I think this collaboration, especially with an industry and then ability to talk to different communities, makes you realize how important it is to explain the methods and train people to use those methods, because you can't do everything by yourself, and you need to enable the community you're working with to then, scale up the research and work you want to do. I worked in psychology department, which is quite interesting. So I've been moving a lot between fields, but the things are not that dissimilar, and we all work towards preparing the future graduates for data-driven positions. So in some ways, in a way, they respond to new software and technology is similar, and we need to think a lot about training. Whilst I was there, I also presented a lot at data science conferences. Edinburgh has quite a dynamic data science community, and that made me feel I want to go back to research. So I got back to research last year, just before COVID hit, and I'll talk to you a little bit about some projects I do now, but only briefly, just kind of give you a taste what I'm working at the moment on. So at the moment, I actually do quite a bit of things, and I continue working with industry because I feel this is what gives me lots of energy, working with real world and solving those problems out there. But I extended my research now to methodological research. So not only I apply a variety of methods, I try to develop new methods and software, but I also engage with various fields like psychology and health research. And some of the recent work I've done relates to environment. So there is lots in common, and I kind of start seeing that now with a bit more ease, and I have more confidence to just go and work different fields, something that I don't think I would done before. I also work with longitudinal data. So UK is one of the leading countries who collects longitudinal data for all sorts of age groups and population demographics. So I'm working on applying existing methodology, but also developing new methodology to harness those data sets. And I also work with an industry partner at the moment in the United States, where we also have a very massive and very, very challenging data set, which requires us to think of both kind of methodology which is out there, but also thinking which kind of methods we could develop to make the best sense of it. I also do a little bit of missing data analysis, and I'm also chairing a local RSS group here in Lancashire. And kind of part of our vision as well is bringing, public statistics and industry together. It's been challenging because of COVID, but hopefully, things get a little bit better and we can start having more conversations about data science as well. So just to give a couple of examples. So as I said, I do different things and I work with different fields, but you see a lot of in parallel. So some of my recent work is for developing methods for multi-level change point models in time series, and it's a joint project with Rebecca Killick and Simon Taylor. And what we worked on is developing effective modeling techniques to understand the changes in periodic behaviors. I think many of you here may relate to this because you do have, especially in consumer data, you have cycles or periodicity and peaks, and we do know how to study those peaks. We can tell when things break, we can see morning peak or evening peak, but how can we study comprehensively the changes in those peaks over time? So that's the methodology we've been working on, and we applied it to economics data, so house price index, for instance, where you could see kind of you have within year cycle, seasonality, and then it shifts as time progresses. But it obviously can be applied to quite a lot of other applications, and we developed our software that can be used to trace this type of relationships. Some other work I do also jointly with researchers in Edinburgh is looking at, again, large kind of complex data sets such as longitudinal data, and we apply a variety of advanced methods such as graphical models, network analysis, to study interrelationships between predictors. And I suppose that's, again, comes quite relevant to consumer data research, because often we see something we either look at the relationship more generally, or we have certain outcome and we look at the variety of predictors. But what if we could just study it all into interrelations or interactions with each other and see how those relationships evolve over time? Lastly, some of the work I do now is in collaboration with a company in the US. And again, we have a big data, and you could say, well, you're doing a totally different project, because now I work with literacy researchers. So I do work with people who are experts in understanding how children learn to read. But the data set that I'm working with are incredibly challenging to analyze, but in some way the skill set I have still fits in. And when this job came up, I think I built the reputation of someone who's not afraid of the data. So people said, oh, Anastasia is not afraid of the data, maybe she can do this project. So I was successful, and I'm been working this for a year now, and we're doing a variety of things, and we collaborate with lots of researchers across the world. And I do see the company every other week, and we developed a very nice collaboration that I really hope to keep continuing working with them as I progress in my career. So just to summarize, so I talk about quite a lot of things, but I think there are a few lessons learned in my journey. I think now it's been 5 years since I've done my MSc project, even a bit more. And I think key things I learned for myself, that there's nothing more exciting than doing research with a partner in industry or any other institution which is not academic. For me, this is exciting because they have a problem they need to solve, and it gives me motivation to then work on it and find the best solution. But for industry, it's in some ways being able to outsource something that they really want to understand but have no time or capacity to look at. It can be challenging to work together, and communication is really important. And what I do, for instance, when my recent collaboration is published, I try to have this conversation from the start. How much time you're going to have, how much time I have, what's your goals at the end of the year? And many companies have quarterly goals that they trying to get to, and having that awareness for me is really important, because then I know how my research can help getting those goals, and also, you know, how can I make the best of their time when I see them. And that's proven to be really useful, and that's all that's required is communication. You can have delays. As researchers, we get delays because we try something and we're not sure if it's working. In industry, you get delays because of data. Sometimes it takes time to get your data in a shape that will be good for research, and we need to communicate those carefully so we don't lose kind of the momentum when we're working together. I also want to take note on cross-disciplinary research. So when I was in CDRC, I was not a geographer, but I did work with geographers and political scientists. Slava is my second supervisor. So it is challenging sometimes, because you do bring different fields in, but it is really rewarding, because at the end of the day, you learn quite a lot of skills. And I think in industry, that's really valued. I think in academia, we're still getting there, even though cross-disciplinary research is there. You know, it's very encouraged by funding. But it's really hard to be a cross-disciplinary researcher, because you kind of need to find still your niche. In my case, it's statistics and applied statistics. But now I've been in so many fields, I sort of feel like I know everything and nothing at the same time. And lastly, kind of, as many people mentioned already today, you get quite an interesting skill set that I never thought I'd have. And it's not only about kind of having this confidence, just going out there and working with people outside academia, but it's also recognizing that we live in a data-driven world. It's not going to change. There's going to be even more data, and it's really exciting to be an academic who can kind of lead that conversation and maybe be part of it moving forwards. And I really hope I can do that in the future. So thank you so much. I just want to say thanks again to the scheme and CDRC and kind of everyone who's been involved promoting this and keep running it till now. I left a couple of research papers that I mentioned today if you want to have a sneak peek, and also my contact details in case you may want to get in touch and talk about something, or maybe talk about data analysis or whatever you might like. Yeah, I think that's me. So thank you so much for listening. Pass on to Jonathan. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's a fantastic kind of career journey story to tell. And I really love your point about, you know, the importance of data-driven skill sets and the fact they're almost life skills now, aren't they, for us? So getting in on the ground floor of those is really quite important. Just a reminder again to those on the audience, if you want to add questions to the chat, please do. But let me come with a couple of questions. I suppose my first one is, you know, you're part of several communities, or you have been, you know, academic research, teaching, commercial engagement. I was just curious which one you enjoy the most, or is it really a mixture of those?
It's really hard to answer, actually. So what I realized, it's important to have a balance. So, you know, I was in fully teaching role and I really felt like something was missing. So I think now I'm kind of on a lookout for maybe a lectureship job or academic job where you have a capacity to combine those. I think a good balance of everything is important for me, but I know people who do dominate their research with industry collaborations as well. I need a bit of both, and I do enjoy doing like theory as well, where it's not relevant for anyone, but I can log in my room. So yeah.
And I suppose you've experienced collaboration in a variety of modes. You know, MSc as a PhD student, as a postdoc, and you're the only representative of the alumni group we've got today who has really gone through a dedicated academic journey, if you like, academic career journey. So what advice would you have for those students who are perhaps at the master's level or contemplating a master's for pursuing academic careers in this area? What should, yeah, are there some things you learned that you wish you'd done better or differently in your own journey?
Thanks for this question. I think in my case, I was a bit afraid about what I'm going to do, because when you do PhD with industry, you have competing interests. So you have a competing interest of a company that you need to satisfy as well. And it's not always the same as what you need for academic career, because you do need to publish and you do need to do certain pieces of work you need to do. I would not worry about it, because I think that the way things looking right now, from perspective of funders as well, I think we are going into cross-disciplinary and industry-academia collaboration. So I think my advice would be not to have too much fear about where I'm going to end up when I finish my PhD, if I'm doing one with industry, because it's going to get you somewhere. And there is lots of people who are looking for researchers who can do research with industry and who have this kind of ability to get the data set and start working on it. So I think it's just, don't be afraid of the future because it looks uncertain and not standard like a traditional path in academia.
Fantastic. That's really, really helpful. The other trick you've learned is to be absolutely perfectly on time. So well done. That's great.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Anastasia. And our final alumnus presentation today is from Nick Samson. And I mentioned at the beginning of the day that we've seen an increasing number of placements and internships from the scheme within professional service firms. And what's really interesting is the number of people that have risen through analytical roles to management and leadership roles within those organizations. And Nick is currently Associate Director at CBRE. He's going to describe some of his own journey, but also some of the work he's doing currently. And I think it's a great example to finish on in terms of the kind of career trajectory that are possible for graduates from this scheme. So Nick, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Yes, hopefully I won't be too repetitive, but very similar to Anastasia. I did my CDRC master's dissertation with British Gas, but it must have been the year before Anastasia did hers, because mine was way back in 2014 in a pre-COVID, pre-Brexit world. I was just having a brief flick through of news stories at the time, and it's quite interesting to kind of bring it all back. But I did an MSc in GIS at UCL between 2013 and 2014, and I was very attracted to the CDRC program because I was very keen at the end of my masters to go into industry. I didn't really have the urge to kind of stay in academia, and I just thought doing a dissertation where I'd be applying the skills I had learned throughout the year with kind of an industry in an industry framework would be very beneficial to me, and I was very attracted to the opportunity to do this with British Gas. Very similar to what Anastasia was saying, they were very welcoming. I spent a lot of time in their office as well. Perhaps not 1.5 months. I like Staines, but perhaps not that much. But as again, what Anastasia was saying, I had a laptop that was kind of hooked up to their data lake, so I could get everything I needed. They're very responsive. I was invited to kind of team away days, which was all very fun. It took me a while to receive my data, but when I did, I was good to go. And then following the end of my master's project, I took up a role at Knight Frank. This was in their residential research team, where a lot of my work was looking at the residential property market and analysing market trends and producing demographic analysis or report metrics for our agency and developer teams. After about 18 months at Knight Frank, I jumped ship and moved to their competitors, CBRE, which are the world's largest real estate advisory firm. We have functions across all areas of real estate, right from facilities management all the way up to office brokerage and supply chain analysis. So I've been there since 2016, and I'm currently an associate director in the supply chain and consumer advisory teams. So I'll just come back to talk about the summer of 2014 in a bit more detail. So I appreciate there's quite a few charts and slightly garish looking colours on here. It was a bit of a trip down memory lane to kind of revisit the dissertation I did. I have to say it does feel like quite a long time ago. But essentially it was very heavily linked to a problem or a kind of industry shift that was happening at the time based on policy coming out of Downing Street. So at the time there was something called the ECO, the Energy Company Obligation, where I think energy companies were obliged to reduce energy consumption among their consumers by a certain amount, and these energy companies would be fined if they didn't meet certain targets. And they kind of thought that smart meter data would be a great way to try to find out which customers might be most susceptible to receiving energy-saving devices or energy-saving measures in their home, such as cavity wall filling or loft insulation or a new boiler. So the kind of ask of this project was to take their consumer smart meter data to link it to other data sets. So, for example, the output area classification, and just determine which consumers or which types of consumers are kind of most susceptible to this marketing of getting their homes more energy efficient. So yeah, it was an incredibly interesting project from my end. It was great to be, working with a real business question that their insights team were kind of starting to look at as well. They were all very interested to see my analysis and my outputs, and it felt quite good to be part of a team. I wasn't just working in isolation on my own. And what you just to kind of briefly look at kind of what I was actually doing in this project. So I received smart meter data from gas consumption, and there was a lot of analysis required to kind of filter this data down into a usable form. There was a lot of noise. There was a lot of pre-processing involved, and all of these processes built up my skills in tools like R and SQL, things that I would later go on to use in my professional career as well. And what I ended up doing was dividing the smart meter data into 5 groups, I think it was, so based on people's usage. And then these 5 groups in turn had 12 clusters, which I produced using the k-means clustering algorithm. And just on screen here, you see 3 quite distinct consumption patterns. So we have this group here, which is obviously very flat in the night, and then it's quite energy consumption goes up in the morning and stays pretty flat until the evening time. I guess this group will be a lot higher since COVID, as a lot of people spend more time indoors and less time out of their homes. Then we had an evening consumption group where they don't really use much in the morning but do in the evening, and then we had a kind of typical, people putting on their heating in the morning, going out, coming back in the evening and putting it back on. So it was a case of clustering these consumer groups together, matching these to other characteristics about the consumer group, such as their tenure, the type of house they live in, what their life stage was, how affluent they are, because it was British Gas were able to access their less affluent customers that were eligible for this insulation. You're just using the index of multiple deprivation, but they were keen to find, okay, well, who else is going to be keen to receive this? Sorry, just seen a message about clicking. So yeah, that was a really interesting project. I had a great time working on it, and it really built up skills in my toolkit that have aided me very well in the 7 years since I completed this project. I then moved on to Knight Frank, as I said, in the research team, and then following that went on to CBRE. So I'll just give a very brief kind of overview. I've tried to keep it as visual as possible as to what I actually do in my current role. So we work very extensively with big data sets to come up with things like network studies or sales forecasting models for retail occupier clients. So I've got an example of one on the screen now. So this is just looking at, okay, well, if this client were to locate a store, in this case on the screen we have London, what's the typical sales density that they could achieve at that location, and how would that vary if we increase or decrease the size of the store? On the left is a bit of a thought piece that we have started to look at, where we take mobile phone data, which we make quite extensive use of, and say, okay, well, since COVID, or since the kind of the last normal month we had, a normal figure in speech marks of February 2020, how has foot traffic returned to retail destinations and split by format? So we've got high street, retail park, shopping centre, because there's been quite an interesting change in the market where, for example, retail parks were always kind of the ugly duckling of the retail world in terms of performance, but the fact that people can drive there, the units are slightly larger. Retail parks obviously seem to have rebounded more quickly than high street and shopping centre locations. So it's been quite an interesting shift, and it's something we're keeping quite a close handle on. A few more things to look at. So in the industry at the moment, there's a very big emphasis on looking at the difference between online and offline sales and how the interplay between online and offline actually works in reality. So again, I can kind of link this quite easily back to the British Gas project I did 7 years ago, because we're just taking real world data from an industry and just making inferences on it and how things might change in the future, and making decisions based on what we're seeing in a very high level of granularity. So what we have up here on screen is a retail client that we've recently worked with, where the grey area at the back is their overall sales, and then the red line and blue line are the online and offline. And you'll see that when, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but when COVID hits, you see there's a huge switch where all sales go through the online channel, and none go through offline in that April 2020 month. But what's interesting is that this retailer was able to still grow their sales despite this huge shift. And it's just a case of saying, okay, well, as things return to some sort of normal, how are these two lines going to change? And this again, just looking at an example of work we did for a client in Italy. It was just looking at what's the online sales per head population across the country, and you see there's obviously a huge north-south split. What are the variables which drive online sales at these locations? So that's kind of what we're seeing in the chart here. And then the final slide is just a typical dashboard that we might build for this client, looking at a heat map of a shopping centre or a high street to say, okay, well, where is consumer activity heaviest? When are these people likely to be there? Our mobile phone data can even say, okay, well, what proportion of those visitors are from overseas? Because we may work with retail clients that are have a particular appeal to international visitors, and then we can match that mobile phone data to demographics to say, okay, well, what are the types of consumers that are visiting this location? Are they my customer, or are they someone else's customer? And just kind of how that all links together. So that combined with sales forecasting is it's quite analytical. But I kind of say that once you move to industry, I think you get a bit more introduction to. There is a bit more of an art to the science as well. It's not just crunching numbers. You always have to understand what the retailer's journey is, what their aim is, and it's not just kind of producing a sales forecast for a street. You always have to kind of know a little bit about the tenant mix on the street, or the nature of the street, or what rents are payable at each location. It's introducing a lot more factors, as well as the industry knowledge which you pick up the more clients you work with and the more time you spend in the industry. I mentioned on my first slide that our team has now merged with our supply chain advisory team as well. So this whole kind of online in-store retail market share shift thing is becoming incredibly important, and as markets like the office market are kind of struggling at the moment, so logistics and industrial space is absolutely booming. So how retailers position themselves with their offer online and offline is absolutely key at the moment. So yeah, I appreciate it's a bit of a whistle stop tour, but I hope it gives you a bit of a flavour as to my career journey post my project with British Gas 7 years ago. It's been quite interesting revisiting it this many years on. There's some pleasant surprises and some bits I probably would do differently if I was to revisit it now. So,
that's great. Thank you so much, Nick. That's a great story, I think, to tell. And you said right from the beginning you wanted to go into industry, and I assume there's no regrets, but you're at the other end now, looking back, as you like, at that trajectory. I was wondering to what extent you've been able to draw on and sort of raise awareness in the business of the academic skills that you developed. To what extent is that welcomed? To what extent have you encouraged colleagues to benefit from things like your R training experience, coding, and so on, to develop the firm's analytical capabilities and perhaps add value to its business? Is that something that's welcomed within the culture? Do you feel able to do that?
Yeah, definitely. So CBR, there's a very kind of entrepreneurial spirit, but I mean that in terms of if you have a good idea, people will listen, and people are always very willing to take on new ideas. And in terms of kind of bringing in the work I'd done in my my masters and from the academic space, it was just being able to bring that rigor to when I'm doing things like sales forecasting or whatever. I do have a slight understanding of the stats behind it, as opposed to just kind of putting numbers into a model and hoping the numbers make sense. So during my masters at UCL as well, they were very we're very good on kind of getting access to data sources, whether that's open source or just kind of understanding what you can get from where, the kind of the pros and cons of each data source, each file format. So just having that kind of deep knowledge about the data that we're using is very powerful, rather than if you just sort of were given it by someone.
Yeah, and I was I'd ask the same question I asked Anastasia in a sense. What advice would you have for students who are contemplating the moves that you made? You said, looking back, you found things that worked well and things that you might have done differently. How would you advise somebody who was looking for a career trajectory similar to yours?
I'd say go down the same route. I think it was an absolutely perfect program for what I was looking for at the time, because if you think of your master's degree, you spend 2 of the terms doing various different modules and learning various different skills, and just having the opportunity to apply those skills in a very detailed project with an industry partner, using real world data to address a real world question. It wasn't just a question that British Gas dreamed up for me just to kind of keep me busy. It was something that there was a lot of emphasis on, and they were really keen to kind of hear what my analysis was showing. And it just kind of bridges that, as I guess Anastasia had the same plan. She went academic, I went into industry, but we both went into this master's scheme with the same the same kind of idea, and just having that bridge between the two worlds was really useful.
Excellent. Well, listen, thanks again for being very timely on the presentation, spot on in terms of time. And again, it's a fascinating story, and it's a great way to kind of conclude our block of alumni presentations. So thank you, Nick, very much indeed. And this takes us to the final part of the event, and that's to think a bit about the future. So we've spent much of today reflecting on the origins of the MDS scheme, hearing from some of the stories of past students and the careers they've ended up in and the various occupations they're now pursuing. But we also need to bear in mind that things are changing, as Martin Squires reminded us quite rightly, and that we need to think about how this scheme might evolve in the future and what other opportunities might be available. So to help us do that, I've delighted to be joined, I hope, in a few moments by a number of panel members with a variety of expertise in their own right. Martin Squires, you'll have heard from this morning, who's Director of Advanced Analytics at Home. Really pleased to welcome Samantha Hughes, who's Analytics Innovation Manager at Avon. And as she reminded us this morning, a subject matter expert with Alteryx, so big data sets, very good. And last but not least, Alex Singleton, who you may have heard mentioned in dispatches from some of the alumni talking about who influenced them most, and supervisors and so on. And Alex, amongst a number of others, has played a very significant role in supervising students who have gone on to great things in terms of their careers. And Alex is Professor of Geographic Data Science at the University of Liverpool, and also Deputy Director of CDRC. So we have about 20 minutes or so to think about the future. But I suppose I wanted to start, just to warm the panel up a bit, with a kind of question about how well they were listening to today's presentations. I know some of you were dipping in and out of them, but you'll have heard some, if not most of the presentations today. And I suppose my first question is really to ask you what strikes you most about what you've heard? And I might ask perhaps Samantha first, just to kick us off.
I knew I'd get that first. Go on, Sam, you can do it. Hello, everyone. So I enjoyed quite a number of the talks today, and it was quite refreshing to hear Alec talk about his work with Sainsbury's, because actually I was sat in property working with Tim Raines and Matt Pratt and Alex. So it was quite nice to hear from his point of view the information that I saw from my point of view within Sainsbury's at the time. I really enjoyed hearing a number of the topics say how, they are pretty much split and they enjoy working in industry and solving industry problems, as well as being and having that drive for academic research and pushing the boundaries. So hearing that as a theme today just really resonates with me as an individual as well. So it's nice to hear that running theme with everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I mean, I think the thing I sort of take away is it's really nice to hear all these great success stories. You know, students, they go through university. Some of them may not have had any industry experience at all to that point. You know, they use the kind of the CDRC offer in the sort of the plural to explore, you know, whether that's kind of the route that they want to go. And, you know, some people go off into industry and that's great. And then others decide to, you know, take that experience, you know, back into academia, and it's kind of self-reinforcing in that way. So, you know, the kind of the range of experiences and what students get from it, I think is excellent. I mean, the other thing I think which is interesting is we're talking here mostly about social science students who, you know, you might not typically think in the abstract in the way in which data science careers are presented. Perhaps they're something that a computer scientist or you know, a mathematician, statistician might do. But actually, I think what the CDRC has done through schemes like the Master's Dissertation scheme is really open up and build those bridges to actually show how social scientists can bring unique perspective to some of these problems which industry have. And because obviously training's sort of baked into these programs, you know, they're actually have the skill set so they can actually really kind of accelerate their careers once they actually hit industry.
Yeah, well, I like that phrase, acceleration. I think that's absolutely right in terms of sort of supercharging people's direction of travel. Martin, from the kind of the practitioner who's worked with some of these individuals in the past, what's your take on today?
I think there's a couple of things it reminded. Oh, sorry, just a minute. There's a couple of things reminded me of it, and one is that sort of lovely comment from the last speaker is to kind of, oh yeah, the team were really nice. I think that bringing together analysts with people from academia, I think it's surprising. It seems to surprise somehow well they get on, which I kind of find strange personally, but it does. The barriers break down very quickly, and I think that's a really good thing. I think the other thing is Alex triggered me on a hobby horse of mine, because my background is I'm not a STEM scientist, and I've ended up in data science, and I think geography undersells itself dramatically. I think the technical skills you've got to have in terms of data analysis as a geographer, anybody who's a geographer who wants to call themselves a data scientist probably has more skills in data science than a lot of people who I think would come to us through computer science or statistics. I think there is an underselling of the complexity of geographic data and the skills needed to handle it. And if you can do that, then most of what's going on in data science in retailers, which virtually all has a geographic element anyway, given shops have a physical location, and which is vitally important. I think that bit of, oh, I can do data science is really important.
Yeah. Although geography has changed a bit. When I did geography in the 70s at Oxford, the most popular course was geographical exploration and discovery rather than data science. But that may be about Oxford rather than about geography, I suspect. I think really interesting. We should look forward, though, I think. And the project model that we've been running with for the last 10 years, I think has proved a really kind of popular and pretty effective method of academic industry collaboration over that period. But I just wanted to ask each of you, again, are there other models, other approaches, perhaps more effective ones, that firms and universities might consider in the future? Are they already there, and we're perhaps not exploiting them? And again, Martin, perhaps I can start with you on that one.
So yeah, again, probably just I guess a couple of things to my mind. I think one I touched on this morning of the current model seems to be very, does industry have projects they would like to bring? Yeah. I actually think industry and most of the companies I talk to are really open to, I've got an idea, and to people to come to us with stuff. Again, it's that where does innovation come from? I think that's really important. The other thing I think is I've always been surprised as to people talk about how do you get content and understand what industry does. You'll always run into timing constraints with certain times of the year or certain priorities with people. But I suspect the amount of retailers or financial services companies who'd be happy to turn up and do some sort of case study presentation to people on courses is pretty large. We're mostly self-interest in how do we recruit the next generation of people, frankly. Yeah. But even so, the amount of people who would be happy to come along and share some of what we do, some of how we do it, and I don't think we get invited very often. So I think there is more about bringing industry in just to kind of talk to people, and there's a willingness there with a lot of companies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Samantha, one of the things that interested me about your career is that you've kind of stepped away a bit from analysis in its own right, and you're actually advising organizations on how to sort of do it themselves to some extent. And how does that affect the kinds of models that you see as being successful in the years ahead for collaboration?
I think what I see when I was working at Sainsbury's work really well is developing the university, with companies' partnerships, and enabling students to come in on a sandwich year for their third year in university undergrad, and actually accelerate those students before they even get to the master's level of applying to these sort of research areas. And the thing that we stepped on from doing the CDRC, we opened up to these sandwich years and accelerated an individual student's skill level within the organization. We welcomed them in, and you had a number of talks today saying how they enjoyed being part of the business. Yeah. They enjoyed being treated like an employee. And that is exactly what we did with our students, is we brought them in, they were a Sainsbury's employee, and we brought them through a whole program of 3 months of training and development to get them up to scratch in the things that we use day in and day out. And then they spent the next 9 months paying it back, which was fundamentally perfect for the business, because we gave them that opportunity to be creative. They understood the data, they could look into it, and then they could take away ideas for projects such as these for masters and beyond, even their sort of dissertation.
Yeah. Because in some senses, by restricting it to the period during which the dissertation is meant to be done for MSc, it's rather restricting for the organisation, because as you say, it determines certain kinds of projects are out of scope because they take too long, and it reduces the opportunities that you might have to evaluate an individual if you're thinking about recruiting at the end of the process, I suppose.
Exactly.
Yeah, and Alex, from the kind of provider point of view, if you like, as a sort of the academic on the panel. The internship has been a tried and tested model. What others have you seen that perhaps could be pressed better into service?
I mean, I think as sort of Sam described, most universities have programs with kind of sandwich placements where students will spend an intensive year, and I think they can work well. The other types of interactions tend to be a little bit less embedded. So it'll be, as Martin said, it'll be coming in to give a kind of career talk to specific groups. I think they're quite good for students to just see, these different types of organizations exist. And for the organizations, I think they've got a benefit because they're advertising what they do to potential sort of people they might want to recruit in the future. But I think it's it's where you have the interaction on things like data and actually doing a project where, there's value for both sides involved in the exchange, which could be a placement year, it could be a master's dissertation project, are the ones where are sort of the most career enhancing. I often feel with any kind of interactions between academics and different partners, and it could be commercial partners or public sector partners, academics often don't do a good enough job, I think, at perhaps selling what the benefits are for that exchange of time or data or ideas. And often it will come from a perspective as, I need some data to do my research. Can I have some data, please? Martin will probably be very busy with all the other things that he does in his job, and it's seen as an additional burden. Whereas, if there's a mechanism, and I think the CDRC does this quite effectively, if there's a mechanism whereby the mutual benefit from that collaboration can kind of be articulated, I think you're much more likely to have a positive outcome from both the partner's perspective and also the kind of research perspective as well.
Yeah, and to some extent, academics would blink it and say, I just want this data, without understanding the commercial context, without articulating the benefits for the organisation. Absolutely. Can I do a follow-up on that, which is really, there's been a kind of proliferation of new initiatives, I suppose, certainly in the UK, doctoral training partnerships, data centres, training programs and networks and so on. And the risk, I suppose, is that these may start to overlap in terms of the partner arrangements. Do you think there's some scope for bringing together or kind of coalescing some of the data infrastructure with the training? And how would one go about doing that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jonathan. I think, it's, I would argue that, it's already happened. And I don't think it's a risk. I actually think it's a great opportunity. Yeah. So, both UCL, Oxford, Liverpool, and Leeds all have very large ESRC investments in PhD training, both in terms of more general social science training with additions of data science through their doctoral training partnership, DTPs. But then also we have the investment for the Centre for Doctoral Training, Data Analytics and Society. Yeah. And much like, with the CDRC providing infrastructure and aspects of training to kind of build the skills necessary to extract value from consumer data and build those partnerships. The CDT works in a similar way in that they're all partnered with external organisations. The advantage of having those types of investments, which were, again, building this bridge between data science and the social sciences, is that when they coalesce with investments like the CDRC, they're coalescing with all of the computation infrastructure that enables these kind of data access, but also, and importantly from the CDRC's perspective, a critical mass of people who are interested in working on these data. And that's where having, elements like CDTs embedded within this ladder of engagement, again, it just adds value to it, because there's more people looking at projects and you can work together collaboratively.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, you mentioned ladder engagement. It's something it's been a theme throughout the day, and Paul introduced it or reminded us of it first thing this morning. To start small, build up trust, focus on longer term relationships with key individuals. But often those relationships are actually pejoratively, someone used the term the anoraks. I think it's Keith. I think but actually with people who have like-minded conversations, if you like. And I suppose one of the challenges is actually building trust and relationships beyond the technical teams that are involved in the subject. I mean, Sam, if I'd asked you, what are the implications, if you like, for internal marketing of collaboration beyond the analysis and technical teams? How does that work? How can it be made more effective?
Internally, marketing CDRC. I think in order to really harness and build that relationship, there has to be a champion internally. There has to be someone who's got an interest, who understands the program, who, the contacts and how the whole process works, so that they can be the sponsor, if you like, and take that up to the higher ups and get that buy-in from the business. Because unless you've got the buy-in from the business to take these engagements forward, then you really struggle and you find you're sort of running against treacle to get anything kick-started. I know, obviously, working at Sainsbury's, I had most of it all set up there. So coming into Avon, there's a lot of hurdles and challenges for me to actually build business cases, to speak to the right people, to get HR on board. I guess from my perspective, what's great is that you guys are already on board, and I have a great relationship and I can ask of any information that I need from this side. But it's about getting those internal hurdles met before I can then start on that sort of start small approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Martin, your experience of that within Pets at Home?
Well, I think across all the companies I've worked with, I think the key thing for me is about the time to generate content. So the bit where I think the internal influencing is something which I'm kind of more than willing to do. The thing that always gets in the way for me is generating content takes time. So generating the stuff I'd use to go and talk to people about. So Keith mentioned this morning I think it was Keith or you this morning mentioned that Guy and the posters for the initial projects. The Doug Awards were massively important. So I was at Boots when with that first award when the Boots project won it. Now that as content, if you're going to sell in CDRC internally, is absolute gold, because you can go out and talk to the internal comms team about, look, we're involved with something that's won an award. And at that stage, you can start to get the message round. So I think it's about letting the internal people, your internal champion, drive the conversation, but just make sure you're giving them lots of material that they can then pick and choose from to go and have the conversations. I'm more than happy to go and have the fight internally. I need the ammunition.
Yeah, and that's what you need. I mean, the other thing that seems to have spurred this on a bit, and we talked about this a little bit this morning, is one of my other devices is going off. I'll just ignore that. Is the impact of the pandemic, on different approaches to both work and study. Do you think there are any lessons emerging that might improve prospects for academic industry collaboration? We've talked about this kind of opening up a little bit, and hope that there won't be any kind of withdrawal back. Again, Sam, could I ask you about that?
I think one of the great things about going through a pandemic is the fact that we're now more digital, we're now more open, we do recognize data more, we do recognize the fact that we can have a conversation with somebody who is a million miles away, whereas previously, going up to Leeds or Liverpool or down to London, you couldn't always get those travel expenses over the line, but now you can be in the room with the academics, you can absolutely take part and be involved in that research as much as they are helping and supporting you.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a lot that has come from COVID-19 that we should be grateful for, even though it's been such a horrific time for most people. Yeah.
I mean, Alex, has that been your experience as an academic working on these collaborations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the use of digital technologies to communicate is obviously a big one, and that's it's filtered through into kind of research, it's filtered through into teaching, and people are a lot more used to it. And it certainly is. We find when we're running events virtually, we may be initially sort of pessimistic about not having to have the opportunity to meet in person, but actually they have much greater reach. And you touched on that, the locations of some of the participants today. It's debatable whether we'd have got those people flown over for an event in Oxford. So I think there's this aspect of reach, which I think is good. And I think actually my observations, and again, this is data science from a sort of academic perspective, is it's actually fared fairly well in the pandemic in terms of our ways of working anyway, because most of the work that we do is on computer screens, and it involves accessing remote servers which are still running and so on. So actually, as a kind of function, it works pretty well. And certainly the past couple of years of last year's master's scheme and this year, I imagine, in part, certainly in addition to that, our CDT's got kind of placements built in as well, and they've actually all worked very effectively remotely, doing data science from home, but still having interactions with the team.
So we've seen at least one good thing come out of the last awful 12 months in respect of, because I know certainly some of our PhD students have had real difficulty doing field work, who are not kind of able to use data in the way that many CDRC students have. We're almost up against the clock now, and I had one final question for each of you, which is, if you had one piece of advice, either for a student thinking about doing a project or for a sponsor thinking about getting involved in the master dissertation scheme or similar, what would it be? Sam, can I start with you?
Yeah, I've interviewed a number of people in this area who've come to sort of take or apply for research. And I guess my piece of advice for the people who are, coming forwards for this is bring your passion and do share those data interests that you've got, and find a piece of data that is really driving your passion. Because I find it takes you away from being scared and stuck behind your CV to actually opening up and sharing what you love to talk about.
Yeah. That's really what you want to see, isn't it? You want to get behind the facade.
Absolutely.
People really are fascinated by and enthusiastic about and passionate for. Absolutely right. Martin, your thoughts?
I think it's similar. It's not being afraid to ask questions. I think there's almost I don't know enough to do that project, or do I know enough to do it, or I have an idea but I'm not sure it's finished. Most of retail is finishing is trying to figure out what to do with half-finished ideas. That piece of actually I can do 3/4. If you've got partway there, then talk to people about it. Don't think it has to be the perfect solution. lots of the better projects I've worked on have been kind of from half-formed ideas that then kind of go off in directions you don't expect them to go in. So yeah, don't let perfection get in the way of doing stuff.
Okay, I'm going to substitute this question for Alex for another one that's just come in on the chat. If you put you on the spot, Alex. Now, here you go. This is from Bruce Jackson, who says, "Can we build a framework that sustains and maintains these relationships between academia and industry that move beyond reliance on the will of the people involved? Or will these things ultimately always be based on personal relationships, networks, and trust? So can you institutionalize some of this stuff?"
Yeah, I mean, we've not got a lot of time left. I could probably talk for
30 seconds to answer a really big question.
The phrase I always come back to is kind of trust takes time. So, this is, a lot of interactions that we have on a variety of levels with partners are based on, people we know very well, and we know them very well because, they've worked at multiple companies. Sam previously worked at Sainsbury's. Works with someone there. He did a PhD part-time at UCL, and there's a kind of a long running kind of social network which underlies all of this sort of stuff. I don't think it's necessarily impossible to do it in the abstract, but I think it will be greatly less successful. And actually, I think the way in which it kind of currently functions, let's say, is something that we've kind of sustained over a very long period of time. Because actually, as Paul sort of talked and Keith were talking about earlier on in the session today, there's a precursor to the CDRC as well in terms of how the Masters scheme came about, and before that, other engagements through Doug and things as well. So, it's a very long running set of relationships that we're talking about in terms of how the scheme operates now. So I think, nothing is impossible, but do I think it'd be very difficult? Yes.
Okay, so no quick wins is the answer, I think, on that.
No.
Well, we're going to have to draw this conversation to a close. As you say, we could go on for a while on this. I'm conscious of the time. So can I just thank Sam, Martin, Alex? Really interesting conversation as always on this topic, and I think that provides quite a nice kind of fitting conclusion to the conversations today. I'm going to pass back with thanks to all the speakers and panelists to Paul Longley, just to conclude the event. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and thank you for all of your work today. It's been, I think it's really been brilliant. Reflecting on it, I suppose my own first thoughts is really going back to Keith's presentation this morning when he was talking about the origins of the scheme in the demographics user group, confined largely to the retail sector. And I think an abiding message of today is that if we thought data were big in 2012, data are certainly very, very much bigger today. And the interest across social science it extends far beyond the retail stalwarts of the demographics user group when the system started. And so I think we've got a real impression of how big the field is. I think something else that Keith started off with, and that we've touched on at the various times, is competitive nerves when you're dealing with businesses, whether people actually feel comfortable with taking a student under their wing who's not an employee and isn't bound by data licensing agreements and IPR agreements and so on and so forth. And I think the tenor of the discussion has really moved beyond those worries about local competition towards thinking about how every one of us wants very much to be part of a competitive knowledge economy. And so there's a difference between the local issues of competition and first mover advantage and the genuine benefits for all, as Jonathan's slides showed this morning. Some individuals are retained by their master's dissertation company. Some go and work for others. Some go and work for work in academia. But everyone, this really is a heads you win, tails you win situation. So Anastasia, I was delighted when she progressed from doing a master's to a PhD, and she's obviously got a great future ahead of her as an academic. But then equally, then Nick, working for the same organisation, took a completely different path. And this really is a sort of heads you win, tails you win situation, not least for social science and the research community. And the community, you get senses of it. My eyes are really bad these days, but when you look at the chat community today, there are clear communalities of interest. The people sort of want to help and make suggestions and make things happen and make things happen better. And so we've heard a lot about through all the diverse experiences. The abiding message, another abiding message, is that there are clearly benefits for all from bringing business and academia together for all parties. So we heard from Alec about the continuity of academic and professional experience, but then we also heard from Nombu how data are very much messier in the real world of practice than they are in the community. And we heard about how software skills, Alec was one of the people talking about SQL compared to, I don't know, the sort of software that you get on a master's course. And even though Cristobal definitely brought software skills to movement strategies, I suspect he's learned rather a lot about web mapping and web analytics and so forth since he joined there. And so there are tremendous advantages to be brought together in terms of the strengths of the different sectors. And sometimes they really do create top-notch findings. Seeing Nick's early slides, I used Guy Lansley kept some of those slides after the presentation, and I used them as a sort of to promote what the program was like for a good few years after Nick won his prize. And arguably, that dissertation, it was one of my favourites, I think, really. It's prescient in a lot of the findings that it reached, and was arguably better than either of the sort of academic and business inputs that went into it. So you can get genuinely top class sort of research out of this, as well as all the benefits of experience. What else? I think it's clear, we've talked about the pandemic at various points today. It's clear that COVID hasn't turned us into hermits. And as Martin, I think, was the first to raise the importance of networks. Well, now we've got another network. We've got the alumni network for the master's dissertation scheme, and we've got evidence that the post-COVID bounce back is very definitely underway, not only in this year's scheme, but looking forward beyond that. And so this network, Sam raised the important point of the need for champions within business organisations and academia. Well, everything's ready, and I think the scheme is very much now firing on all cylinders. So I think those would be my concluding observations. I think it just falls to me just to make the usual thanks for people who made today happen. Characteristically, at the end, Bruce Jackson from ESRC, absolutely lovely Bruce, lobs in a grenade at the sort of penultimate question in the forum. We're really grateful to Bruce for his understanding of the way that business can meet academia at ESRC, and he's somebody who's also revolved around in different walks of life, and perhaps exemplifies the importance of having a champion within the research council sphere for activities such as CDRC. And I hope that we've fulfilled a lot of the promise and trust that you've put in us. Thanks very much to Jonathan for comparing the activities today on behalf of CDRC, and of course the thanks also go to Claire and Mel, who did all of the spade work and the preparatory work to make this happen. And so Claire and or Mel will be in touch with participants in the coming weeks to think about things that we can do better and ways that you can each be champions, whether as students, academics, or established business staff, to help the master's research dissertation move forward. So thanks once again to everyone for listening, and to everyone that participated and presented today. And yes, we'll be in touch. Thanks very much.